Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to be revisiting a highly requested topic, watercolor sketchbooks. 3 years ago, as part of my top 5 series, I did a video on watercolor sketchbooks, but at the time I had only tried a handful of different brands, so it wasn't really a fair assessment. Since then, I've tried several more, my knowledge of watercolor supplies in general has grown, and my personal preferences have changed over time. And so have certain products, I think, but we'll get to that in a little bit. In this video, we are not going to strictly be ranking sketchbooks in part of a top 5 series, though I will let you know which are my favorites at the end. Instead, we are going to be taking a comprehensive look at 6 different watercolor sketchbooks to see how they stack up against each other. This video is going to be a beast, and it would have been impossible for me to both purchase every single sketchbook in existence, not to mention feature each of them in depth in a single video. I didn't want to leave anyone out without due cause, so for that reason, I set up some parameters for the journals that we will be testing out today. These guidelines are somewhat biased towards features that I prefer, but I do think that's fair since I bought all of them myself. The first criteria is that they all had to be hard-covered sketchbooks. I prefer hardcovers to soft covers, but this does eliminate some popular brands like those from Stillman & Byrne, which I have already tried in the past and wasn't a huge fan of for my particular painting style. The second is that they all had to be book-bound instead of spiral-bound. This is primarily to reduce the number of products overall, but I also just prefer this style in terms of storage in my studio. The next criteria is that they all had to be marketed as having cold-pressed paper, which eliminated some products like the Paul Rubens Hot Press Journal. I wanted these all to be around the same size so that they were manageable, so I chose A5 in size, which is approximately 8 by 5 or 8 by 6 inches. Finally, they all had to be available for purchase in the US, since that's where I live, and they had to be available for purchase individually, which ruled out some certain brands like Arteza and some Etchr products that are only available in multi-packs. All of these journals are acid-free, so you won't hear me repeating that throughout the video, and all of them have cellulose paper unless I say otherwise. Each assessment will include looking at the physical characteristics of each book, a paper test that objectively shows how the paper handles water and paint, and a more subjective demonstration during which I can give you my personal opinion on each painting experience. Hopefully by the end you will have all the information you need to make an informed buying decision that meets your own personal needs for your own watercolor sketchbook or journal. So that you can clearly see what the paper tests are going to be showing you later on, I'm going to give you an overview of the process that I did in all 6 journals here. That way, when we get to each individual journal later, you can take your time and look at the scans that more accurately show the textures and features of each page rather than the process of me painting them over and over again. I started off using masking tape to lay out a grid. This will not only give me clean, pretty edges, but will also let us know if the paper tears easily when it's time to remove it. In the first column of boxes, I'm using Terra Rosa from M. Graham, which is a highly pigmented and opaque Indian red color. The first box is wet paint on wet paper. The second box is using dry paint, meaning as little water as possible, on wet paper. The third is a really juicy wet wash on dry paper, and the last box is dry paint on dry paper. For the 4 boxes in the center of the page, I'll be using a granulating and non-granulating color to show a flat wash on the left and a wash that is softened off into a gradient wash on the right. The top color is Piemontite Genuine from Daniel Smith, and the bottom color is Quinacridone Violet from Core. The final column is showing glazing and lifting properties of both a non-staining and a staining color. The first box will eventually be 3 layers of Ultramarine Deep from Sennelier, which is a color that easily lifts or does not stain, and the second box is a Phthalo Turquoise from Vinci, which is a heavily staining color that does not easily lift. Colors that lift can sometimes be difficult to glaze because the paint in the previous layer might lift up during future layers that you paint over it. Some papers are better than others at holding on to paint, and if you are someone who uses a lot of layers, this could become problematic as we, myself included, may end up overworking the painting. If you only use 1 or 2 layers, though, it might not be a problem at all. The third and fourth boxes are the same colors as above, but here I will be attempting to directly lift dry paint off of the paper. These tests will show how easily or difficult it might be to fix mistakes that have already dried. Finally, the last test is when I remove the masking tape, and I did so very carefully and checked for any tearing that occurred during the process. After the paper test, I'll be doing a demonstration in each of the sketchbooks. As you watch the video, I invite you to look at the demos with a really technical eye rather than just whether or not you like the animal that I'm painting, though I of course always love hearing your favorite stories about species that I paint. In this video though, they're going to be helping us as tools so that I can share a variety of different techniques with all of you. For each demonstration, I really wanted to try and implement as many as my own common painting techniques as possible so I could intentionally stress test each paper's limits. This meant that each painting got a big wet wash on the background so we can see how it handles water, followed by more detail work and several layers because that is how I tend to work. As far as other tools go, for each painting I will be using my silver black velvet brushes and a single binder clip to keep the page as flat as reasonably possible while I worked. In the video segments, you can really watch for how I either was fighting with the paper or sailing through it really smoothly, and in the scans at the end of each of the segments, I included a completely unedited image of the painting so that you can see how the washes dried, the amount of detail that I was able to achieve, and even how much the paper buckled or not by looking at the blown out highlights or the much darker valleys in the paper. The scans that don't have those issues in them means that the paper dried a lot more flat. The last thing that I wanted to mention before we dive into the first sketchbook is that all the supplies that I'm using today are listed in the description below, including affiliate links to the sketchbooks that we're looking at today and all of the colors that I use in the demos, because I know there'll be people who are asking. In addition to my usual affiliate links, I'm also going to be selling these exact sketchbooks that I'm working in, including the paintings, in my Etsy shop on April 5th. I'll explain more about my next shop restock at the end of this video. This video is not sponsored. I purchased all of these sketchbooks myself, and I spent 3 weeks filming and editing this guide to what I hope will be a very helpful resource for all of you. If you'd like to pick yourself up a nice new sketchbook that has an original painting in it and a personalized thank you note to all of you while helping to support this type of content, I'd really appreciate you checking out the Etsy shop on April 5th. If a new sketchbook isn't in your budget but you'd still like to help support the channel, you can gain access to high-resolution scans from this video and many others that I have on my YouTube channel, and over 100 animal tutorials over on my Patreon. If none of those are in the cards for you, that is completely fine. Thank you so much for watching, and if you can give the video a like and a comment down below, it'll help the video and the channel gain more visibility. With all of that out of the way, let's finally get into the details. First up is my old friend, the Handbook Travelogue Artist Watercolor Journal by Speedball with 95-pound or 200 GSM paper. I believe I purchased 2 of these before this video, and they were my favorite journals 3 years ago when I did the first sketchbook video. It's 8¼ inches by 5½ inches and has 30 sheets of paper totaling 60 sides if you use both front and back. The paper weight is 95 pounds or 200 GSM, meaning that it's quite a bit lighter than the standard 140-pound watercolor paper, but it is a fairly common weight for sketchbooks. It comes shrink-wrapped in plastic and has a paper cover sleeve. The closure strap is made of textured elastic and rubber, and the cover is a texture similar to something between linen and canvas. In addition to not being able to put most stickers on the cover, like many of us like to do, both of these textures are a bit grating to someone like me who has sensitivity issues. It's probably not an issue for most people, but I wanted to mention it here just in case you also deal with that. Inside the cover, there is a block to put your name and information, as well as the company's logo, but other than that, you can paint on both of these front sheets of paper as you wish, as they are the same texture as the rest of the book. There is a plastic pocket on the inside of the back cover if you'd like to keep anything in there, and there is an orange, slightly elastic bookmark cord on the inside of the journal. The pages are sewn together with 3 visible stitches inside. They use glue to help with the binding, which does seep out through some of the holes and mark the pages, which could disrupt some full-page spreads if you wanted to paint across the seam. At the time of recording this video, this sketchbook is listed on Amazon for $17 USD. For the paper tests, the first wet into wet shows you how much this paper likes to facilitate movement. The smooth surface is not always super absorbent and allows for the paint to dance across it. You can even see the pooling around the edges of the second box for the dry paint on wet paper, because once the pigment found its way to the pooling water around the edges, it just kind of took off. The third box shows you that the paper does not dry evenly. Edges of this wet wash dried more quickly than the centers, which caused back runs. The last box shows you that you do have good control when using high pigment to water ratios. As we move through the video, or if you compare the scans over on Patreon, you'll get to see the comparison of the different granulation patterns of the Piemontite on the different journal paper. Whether or not you like one or another is up to your personal preference, but they do vary quite a bit. What you can see on the Quinacridone Violet washes is that the paper again shows uneven drying time as the water has pooled all around the edges and caused back runs as it dried. Both the Piemontite and Quinacridone Violet soften off reasonably well, but keep in mind that the lightest areas of the wash are still heavily pigmented instead of closer to the white of the paper. This was due to the fact that the paint wanted to move across the paper really easily, and it was harder to control that short gradient wash. In the last column, we can see that third wash of Ultramarine gets almost entirely lost as it lifted up the layer that was below it. The Phthalo Turquoise did a better job, but you can still see that there's unevenness in the washes. Both paints lifted reasonably well since this paper does not hold on to pigment very strongly. Finally, when I pulled off the masking tape, there was some minor tearing along the binding edge of the paper, but the rest of it was fine. This was the first demonstration painting that I worked on, and I was really excited to visit an old favorite, but that was quickly met with some uncertainty as the paper immediately buckled under the water, causing irregular pooling in the background. I immediately tried to tap into this the best that I could to go with the flow, literally, and embrace that watercolory goodness, also known as back runs. These were not limited to my background, as even the small washes on the face and body dried unevenly. I was still able to get the details later on and use the paper's liftability to my advantage when the paint strayed too far or got too dark too quickly, like you'll see across the bridge of the nose. Now, I used this sketchbook for over a year without complaint, and I went through 2 of them, so I clearly didn't have any major issues when I first started out with it. Despite the challenges, I didn't hate working on it now either. Even though I had to accept a different approach, it at least wasn't frustrating and I had a good time painting it. In the final result, you can see one big bloom on the right side of the background that was not intentional, and it doesn't really convince anyone that it was supposed to be there all along. The rest of it, though, is passable and looks like an artistic choice, so overall, not too shabby. The next sketchbook was the catalyst for this entire video. While I was looking for my next personal watercolor journal, I came across this, which I had never seen before. This is the Handbook Travelogue Artist Watercolor Journal by Speedball, which should sound familiar. This book is the same as the last in every way, except that this one has 140 pound or 300 GSM paper. Since the biggest drawback to the 95-pound version is its inability to hold water well, I was really excited to see this and try it out. I don't know how widespread this journal is, but I did find it on Amazon, and the only visual difference between this one and the former book is that this one is thicker and has a blue cover sheet instead of a red one. At the time of this recording, this sketchbook is listed on Amazon for $26 USD. So the question is, does a thicker paper equate to a better paper, and is it worth that extra $9? Well, that's up to you. The objective paper tests look very similar to the 95-pound version, right down to the light tearing along the binding edge of the paper when I removed the masking tape. However, here is where the more subjective demonstration evaluation comes in. The big wash on the background softened off beautifully, and that is Florentine green from Stoneground Paint Co., by the way. It's an absolute favorite of mine for backgrounds recently. As I moved on to painting the mountain lion, I really piled on the glazes because that's how I tend to work. The paper is still good at lifting, so I would advise to use a soft brush to avoid any unwanted movement of previous layers, but using my silver black velvet brush worked completely fine for me. The granulation of the background shows up really nicely, but since the paint tends to flow so freely on this paper, a lot of the physical texture that I tried to paint in disappeared when I tried to soften off the edges gently like I usually do in my typical style. This is not necessarily a bad thing for people who love smooth textures and want a little extra help from their paper in achieving them. It all depends on what you're after. Next up is the Pentalic Aqua Journal. This is another one that I have tried in the past, but with some mixed feelings about it. I had to order this one from Blick as it was unavailable at the time on Amazon. It arrived with absolutely no frills, no plastic, and no sleeve. I have ordered, I think, 2 of these in the past, and I believe both of them came with like that cover sleeve type of thing, and the advertising pictures show one, so I'm not sure why I didn't get one, but that's not really important to me. All the paper seemed fine and unmarred. The closure strap is made of a smooth and snug navy blue elastic band, and the cover is a smooth blue faux leather finish. It's great for stickers and sensitive hands, so pluses there. It is 8 by 5 inches and has 24 sheets of paper totaling 48 sides if you use front and back. The paper weight is the standard 140-pound watercolor paper that we would typically use for a watercolor painting, and it does have a slightly mechanical finish to it. The bookmark is a long black ribbon with the brand's name printed on one side in silver, and it has a black elastic pen holder. Inside the cover is completely unadulterated with no text or boxes of any kind so that you can just jump straight into painting. The pages are sewn together with 4 visible stitches along the inside, and as far as I can tell, there doesn't seem to be any glue that bleeds out onto the pages. However, I have had issues with this sketchbook in the past about the paper fibers along the binding edge either breaking or tearing and falling out. This one also shows some signs that might happen depending on how you handle it over the lifespan of the journal. There is a paper pocket or cubby at the back of the journal, and it does not have a little lid floppy thing like the Handbook Travelogues do. The sides of this pocket are lined with kind of like this reinforced canvas looking ribbon. I'm not really sure what it is, but it's reinforced on the sides. At the time of recording the audio for this video, the sketchbook is listed on Amazon back in stock for $28 USD or on Blick for $22 USD. For the paper tests, this paper also likes to let the paint flow with pretty wild abandon when wet, but it does seem to keep the drier paint in check a little bit more than the handbooks did. Here you can see that the wet on dry box dried evenly without back runs. The granulation was a little less predictable on this paper, but the washes do soften off to a lighter shade, indicating that it's a little bit easier to control the washes in the sketchbook. If you're really looking closely, you can also see some back runs that run along the edges of the flat Quinacridone Violet wash, indicating a slightly uneven dry time, but it is much better than the previous journals were. This paper handles glaze as well, but doesn't lift quite as cleanly as the handbooks do. There was slight tearing along the binding edge of the paper when I lifted the masking tape, but nowhere else on the page did it tear. I almost forgot to mention the theme of these paintings and just remembered now, so over on my Patreon, we have monthly community challenges focusing on different habitats and the animals that live in each every month. For March, our theme was scrublands, which are near and dear to my heart since I saw so much of them back in California. So all of the animals that I chose for these demos are California wildlife that live in scrublands, including this cute little California quail. The first painting that I did was of a mule deer doe, a female deer, mule deer, something along those lines, and it's a photograph that I took in the foothills of the city that I used to live in. The next 2 reference photos that I used came off of Pixabay, which, if you don't already know, is a copyright-free reference photo site, so you can look for different animals or whatever it is you paint on that website for inspiration. In the previous journal that I had, one of my issues is that the back side of the paper was not fun for me to paint on. It probably would have been fine for ink work, but I didn't like it for watercolor. This journal seems to look the same on both front and back, or very similar at least, and I haven't used it obviously extensively past the paper tests and the one painting, but it does look like an improvement over the last one that I had. For this quail, I started off with a granulating wash of cerulean blue in the background, which does bring out that mechanical texture quite a bit. However, this one is not quite as bad as the previous sketchbook that I had that had this issue. The layers were easy to lay in, softened off nicely where I wanted them to, and didn't go wild when I added more water. Bonus points, the paper barely warped at all while I was painting this, so that's always a good sign. This whole painting process I think was the quickest out of all of them, and it was just a really enjoyable experience. Next up is the Moleskine Art Watercolor album. Moleskine has a lot of brand recognition, and I'm sure that their sketchbooks are really high quality given how often I see them used by other artists. However, I have never been impressed with the watercolor sketchbook reviews that I've seen, and therefore have never worked with one before this video. Starting with the specs, it comes in a plastic shrink wrap with a recognizable moleskin paper sleeve in their cream color accented by a soft blue-gray, and this is where we see the first oddity. It states that this is a 200 GSM paper, but also that it's a 135-pound weight paper. 200 GSM in every other brand of watercolor paper I've ever seen equates to 95-pound paper, so this is either a typo, a lie, or somehow weights are not equally standardized. I admit that I don't have experience making paper, but it seems a little fishy to me, and if it is intentional, it's not great. The closure strap is made of a smooth and slightly loose black elastic band, and the cover is a smooth black faux leather finish. The inside of the little branded sleeve on the outside of the journal actually has some information on it. It helps you make circles and measure angles, which none of the other sketchbooks come with. This is also the only journal that doesn't start with watercolor paper right in front. Instead, it has a cardstock kind of cover page situation. This is also the only journal that we're looking at today that does not have a bookmark, which may or may not be important to you. The journal is 8 1/4 by 5 inches, and there are 36 sheets of paper that equate to 72 sides of paper. The paper is 25% cotton, which is surprising because it doesn't really handle that way, but we'll get to that shortly. The pages are sewn together with 3 visible stitches along the inside, and there doesn't seem to be any glue that bleeds out onto the pages. However, they're not centered, which I found a little bit odd. I'm not sure how this will affect the pages over time, but depending on how you grab or turn the pages, there might be some uneven wear and tear there. There is a paper pocket or cubby at the back with no flap or lid, just like there was in the Pentalic Aqua journal. The sides of this pocket are lined with reinforced canvas-like siding, also similar to the Pentalic, but these sides are black. When I purchased this sketchbook several weeks ago, it was $17.50 on Amazon, but at the time of recording this audio, it has dropped to under $16 USD. For the paper tests, the washes are best described as inconsistent, I guess. The wet on wet spreads and bleeds out to the sides, but then back runs on top of itself. And the wet on dry had the most uneven drying out of all of the journals that I tested. The granulation intensely settles into these relatively large grooves on the paper, which may or may not be to your liking. However, it also made getting flat washes nearly, if not completely, impossible, which I don't think is great regardless of how you look on it if you can't get it to do a thing that watercolor paper should do. Neither Quinacridone Violet or Phthalo Turquoise, which are both very smooth, even colors, would lay into a smooth wash, which was a little bit disappointing. This paper doesn't handle glazes very well, in part due to the inability to lay down a flat wash of color. By the third layer, the Ultramarine was lifting up the paint underneath and making a mess. The Phthalo Turquoise was slightly better, but still not smooth since the washes weren't smooth to begin with. The 2 pros I can say about this paper is that liftable colors lift very cleanly, and there are no noticeable tears when I lifted the masking tape. So if those 2 things are important to you, maybe this would work. When I started the demo, the paper started fighting me immediately though. I couldn't even get a simple wash down without the paint getting pushed around rather than gliding across the paper like a watercolor wash should. Normally, I'd skip over some of this wash footage since it's not very exciting compared to the actual animal, but because of how difficult it was to lay down, I thought it might be useful for you to see. localized small washes to block in value went a little bit better, but softening off was still rather unpredictable, and it was hard to balance the water properly to avoid back runs. This painting is of a gray fox, and I just wanted to address the giraffe in the room because I know it looks like this fox is all neck, like disproportionately so, but the way that the fox was sitting in the reference photo that I found on Pixabay and the slenderness of the fox made the neck kind of just bleed into the shoulders, and it's cropped right before the legs would start. So that's kind of my bad for cropping it that way. But I mention all that in relation to the painting process because you do see a lot of fur on his neck, and it was particularly difficult to paint. I've used the same type of technique and the same brushes to paint fur pretty much every time I've sat down to paint a mammal for the last several years. I even have a class on Skillshare about watercolor animal textures, how I lay down paint and soften off some of the edges to allow for the texture to come through while still keeping a watery vibe. And all of that being said, this paper bested me, or it foiled me. I don't know, you can decide which. The first wash just vanished in the water. It just all kind of blurred out and I lost all the texture that I had put down. And subsequent layers were much less detailed than I'm usually able to achieve in a painting. All I can say is that I really didn't enjoy the process, and I don't think it ended up looking very good either. I was able to get some detail on the face when I sized down to a smaller brush, but even there, the details like the whiskers were a lot wider than I would like them to be. This sketchbook would be suitable for less detailed work by artists who don't use more than 2, maybe 3 layers tops, but you'd be pushing it with that 3rd layer. It also may be good for watercolor and ink or mixed media drawings more so than just watercolor alone. Just because this sketchbook isn't for me doesn't mean that it's not for someone. So if you do use this sketchbook and you love it, let us know what you'd like to use it for down in the comments below. I almost missed the Etchr Mixed Media Sketchbook when I was shopping for this video because it is A, not advertised as a watercolor sketchbook, but it totally is, and B, because it's usually sold in packs of 3. However, we'll cover both of these issues or concerns over the course of this video. Starting at the beginning, Etchr sketchbooks arrive in a lot of packaging, and whether or not you view this as luxe or wasteful is up to you and your stance on environmental type issues. I did remove the plastic before filming, so I apologize that I'm not able to show you that here, but there was shrink wrap on the outside of the paper cover folder thingy, and then the paper cover folder thingy with the fancy elastic closure, and then another layer of plastic around the sketchbook itself, and then finally the sketchbook underneath. The sketchbook itself has a loose dark gray elastic closure and a white soft canvas-like fabric on the cover. The cover is not hard like the Travelogue linen covers are. It has more of a plush feel, and I believe on their website it says that this is more customizable so that you can paint it or personalize it however you'd like. However, I will tell you right now, if you have any fur kiddos in the house, this is a fur magnet, so you have been warned. The outer dimension of this sketchbook is A5 in size, which is a little over 8 inches by a little over 5 inches. The watercolor paper starts off on the inside cover with no text and no boxes, and there are 26 sheets of paper for a total of 52 sides. There is a paper pocket or cubby at the back of the journal with no flap or lid, just like there was in the Pentalic and Moleskine journals. The siding of this one, again, is in a similar texture, although it's like a little bit more ribbony than the others, and is off-white or ivory in color. The paper weight in this journal is 230 GSM, which is somewhere between the 95-pound and the 140-pound paper. However, the massive bonus here is that this one is 100% cotton. The pages are sewn together with 3 visible stitches inside. I don't see any glue, and the stitches are slightly off-center again, though not as much as they were in the Moleskine. Typically, these sketchbooks are sold on Etchr's website in packs of 3 for $79.50 USD, which includes shipping. That equates to $26.50 each. However, the reason I was able to get them for this video with our aforementioned parameters is because they are also available on Amazon for $25 each individually. I'm guessing that you'll immediately notice a massive difference between the test pages that we've already looked at, especially the last one and this one. Wet on wet washes bloom like you'd expect them to on cotton paper. Dry on a wet softens off but gives you more control, and the wet on a wet wash dries perfectly even. It is by far the best out of any of the ones that I tested. The granulation is beautifully random, the flat wash is smooth, and the gradients soften off as expected. The glazes are all clear and defined at each of the 3 stages for both the lifting and non-lifting colors, and the only possible downside is that the paper does hold on to those pigments pretty well. So on the lifting tests, you'll see that they didn't lift quite as cleanly as the others, but whether or not you need that technique is up to you. There were no tears when I lifted the masking tape at the end of all of this. For the demo on this one, I painted a Western screech owl that actually ended up being larger on the page than they are in real life. I didn't intend for the face to be so big, and it took a proportionally longer time to paint than I did in some of the other demos due to its size. I used granulating ultramarine pink in the background and then really put this paper through the ringer in terms of layering on the owl itself. Unlike the struggle that I had in the past painting, these layers and details went on easily and allowed me to build up depth on the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and any future washes, all while barely buckling the paper. Now, before anyone accuses me of playing favoritism and spending more time here than I did with the others, I can give you several reasons why that is not the case. I spent more time in this journal because I actually have a personal and completely stubborn bias against this brand or journal or whatever you want to call it. And if I'm being honest, I was maybe trying to find some kind of fault in this product. As a recap, probably not a quick one, in August of 2019, I bought their extremely expensive, top-of-the-line Perfect sketchbook, which was only available in a 2-pack and cost $120 for the pair. When I got them, they had way more packaging than this one did, and 2 layers of like the actual bubble mailers that they were mailed in, and that immediately kind of put me on edge since I am a conservationist at heart. And then when I opened the books, one of the books had some damaged pages, including one where the bookmark was the color like leached onto the paper from that space. So I contacted the company asking if I could replace the damaged one, send it back to them and get a new one. And while at the time they were located overseas, and I understand that that might not have been a reasonable solution for them, I was still pretty upset at the time that I spent $120 on these 2 sketchbooks and they arrived damaged. In the email that I sent to them, I also tried to word as gently and kindly as possible to give them feedback on the excessive packaging and the problems I saw with it, and asked if there was any consideration for reducing waste moving forward. Their resolution to that email was that I was offered a coupon for my next order, which I was not interested in because I'd already spent $120 and they were going to send me excess packaging. So I just left it alone and kind of walked away. However, 2 or 3 weeks later, I was contacted by someone else in their company asking if I wanted to review their products on the channel. I relayed the former correspondence with them. I sent them a copy of those emails, and they finally addressed my comment about the packaging because they ignored it the first time, and I was told that the packaging was necessary to keep products safe during international travel. I just don't know why you need 2 or 3 layers of plastic and 2 layers of paper and 2 bubble mailers to do that, because I don't see any other companies doing that. But that's my personal preference. Obviously, I'm not the one running the company. Anyway, needless to say, I declined their offer to do anything on the channel. I didn't use the coupon that they offered me, and I never mentioned it on this channel because I didn't want to seem petty about it. I just wanted to let it go, and I used them personally, and that was it. Especially because they were a new company, and I know that they were still working out logistics. I haven't spoken with them since, and like all the journals in this video, I purchased this one with my own money. Long story, not so short, I completely admit that I had been holding on to this grudge due to a poor customer service interaction, so when people started talking about this more affordable line with the white covers, I wasn't interested. I just, left it alone. But then this video came along. In the past year and a half, it looks like Etchr has expanded and now has distributors on multiple continents, and there's one in the US in Miami. Since I didn't order this directly from their website, and it's a different line of sketchbook, and it's a year and a half later, I'm not really sure if they've made packaging adjustments throughout the past year and a half, but this one did have less packaging than the first order that I got. So that's something, I guess. But getting back to the demo, in terms of spending so much time on this darn owl, I admit that I intentionally gave the sketchbook the most difficult of the 6 subjects in the lineup to see if there was anything I could find fault in. But you know what? I can't, because it's great. This sketchbook finds a perfect balance between being high quality, yet not so expensive that I'm worried about messing it up. Its price is comparable to the others, even though it's 100% cotton, and painting on it was a pleasure. I even ordered the smaller A6 size for my next personal watercolor journal. So maybe that story was longer than you cared or wanted to hear about, but despite my own biases and trying to find fault in this product, I could admit that it is a wonderful and great sketchbook. Moving on to our final contender, we have the sketchbook that I personally have been using for the last couple of years, the Hahnemuhle Watercolor book. Sticking first with the specs, this is a sleek dark gray sketchbook that has a linen-like texture that sits somewhere between the rougher Travelogue texture and the smooth Pentalic or Moleskine texture. The texture primarily runs vertically down the page instead of in both directions, and it has a snug black elastic closure. This comes wrapped in one layer of plastic with the typical paper sleeve with the company's branding information and information about the journal. The sketchbook is marketed as A5 in size, but rather than the outer dimensions being A5 like the Etchr was, I think that the paper in this book is A5 because the cover is a little bit wider. The watercolor paper starts on the inside cover, and there's no text or boxes, and there are 30 sheets of paper for a total of 60 sides. The paper is 200 GSM or 95 pounds, and the pages are sewn together with the 3 visible stitches that we've seen in most of the journals today. Like in the Travelogue journals, there is some glue that seeps out on some of the pages. There is a narrow dark maroon or warm brownish colored ribbon for a bookmark, and there is no pocket in this book, meaning that you have watercolor paper from cover to cover. I don't mind that because I never use it anyway, but for those of you who like pockets, that could be a big downside. At the time of recording this video, this sketchbook is listed on Amazon for around $21 USD, but I have seen it fluctuate a bit in price over the couple years that I've used them. For the paper tests, we can see that there is a pretty wild spread for the wet to wet wash, with pigment eagerly flowing to the edges. The dry on wet showed really controlled blooms, and the wet on dry has mostly even drying patterns, but there was some unevenness around those bottom edges. The washes show similar patterns to the other lightweight cellulose papers. There is consistent and pleasant granulation, but there is also a background on the Quinacridone Violet wash that is really pronounced on the right edge. This is primarily due to the fact that the paper buckled and water was being pulled down by gravity. The washes soften off well, but there is notable lightness to them in the mass tone, meaning that they didn't really seem as saturated in color as the other journals were. The Ultramarine didn't layer well on the third pass, but the Phthalo Turquoise held up all right. Lifting was moderate, which is what I expected from this type of journal. There was some tearing of the paper near the binding edge when I removed the masking tape, and the glue is particularly bad on this page. Now, whereas I was biased against the Etchr book, I came into the Hahnemuhle after years of use, so I had some observations already lined up. I loved this journal when I first started using it. I couldn't tell if I liked it more than the Travelogue, but I just kind of ran with it since I liked the cover better and never used the back pocket in the Travelogue anyway. However, in the recent books that I got from them since the fall of 2020, I noticed that there was a difference while I was using them. Now, I still can't tell if this was just me growing out of them or if they've actually changed something about the sizing and the paper, but I did know that I wasn't enjoying them as much as I used to. I saved this journal for last because I am so deeply familiar with it, especially recently, and I expected after 5 other journals it would be like coming home at the end of a long day, but boy was I wrong. Especially coming off the tails of the cotton paper in Etchr, this was not super fun. I was completely shocked, honestly. Paint wasn't moving like I wanted it to at all. I was having a hard time getting smooth washes. There were washes that were just like staying exactly where I put them, and by the time I went to go spread them off like a second later, they had already started drying, and pigments were getting stuck in places that I didn't want them to be stuck in. The paper buckled pretty heavily, and I don't know what to say other than it was a really big disappointment, especially after I have loved this journal for so long. I still don't know if something changed over the years in the manufacturing process or if it's an anomaly, but I've had several of these sketchbooks, I think 3 since December, that have all had the same issue. Or maybe I just grew out of my personal taste for them. I don't know which of those it is, but I'm just giving you the information so you can do what you will with it. Part of this video was me wanting to find out if there was a better fit for my personal watercolor journal, and sadly for the Hahnemuhle Watercolor book, I think we'll be parting ways after spending the last 2 years together. I'm sorry. And for those of you wondering, this is a Stellar's J, again, a photograph that I took, I think on the same day as the photo that I took of the deer. So, which are my favorites? My top 3 choices from these 6 journals would be the Travelogue 140 pound version, the Pentalic Aqua journal, and the Etchr sketchbook. As we covered, they all have different pros and cons based on what you're looking for in a watercolor sketchbook, but it's pretty clear to me that I prefer the heavier weighted papers regardless of whether or not it's made from cellulose or cotton. Unfortunately, that puts the Travelogue 95 pound, the Moleskine, and the Hahnemuhle in the bottom. These are all the lighter weight papers that tend to buckle under the large washes, and they don't like to take multiple layers very well. You might really enjoy these if you have a more mixed media or ink and wash style approach, but for someone who wants a more full and enjoyable watercolor experience, I'd recommend one of the other 3 journals. I'd love to hear what you think in the comments below. Have you tried some or all of these sketchbooks? And if so, which one do you like best? And if you haven't tried any of them, which one are you most excited to try out? We did it, guys! Thank you for making it until the end of the video. We have covered 6 watercolor sketchbooks in as much detail as I could manage while holding on to the last bit of my sanity by a thread. I hope that these weeks of researching, painting, and editing are useful for you as you find your own favorite watercolor sketchbook. As a reminder, all of the supplies and colors that I used in every painting are all listed in the description below and include affiliate links in case you want to use them to purchase your own sketchbook and help out the channel at the same time. If you enjoyed the mountain lion painting in this video, if you want to join us over on Patreon at the postcard tier, this will be the April limited edition postcard print that goes out. So anytime between April 1st and April 30th, if you pledge over on Patreon, I'll send you one of these with a little note on it. Once again, all of these paintings and their attached sketchbooks will be available in my Etsy shop on April 5th. I have been getting really overwhelmed with fulfilling orders as they kind of come in a couple at a time, specifically the small sticker orders, and I feel really bad when I don't get them out right away. So I'd like to try doing a monthly restock for a couple of months and see how that goes. The shop will be open from April 5th to 11th, and I will fulfill all of those orders on April 12th and 13th and get them right off in the mail to you. Then the next shop restock will be at the beginning of May. I know this is not ideal, but I am struggling in a lot of different areas right now and just trying to keep up at the moment. If this thing goes well for the first couple of months, we can continue doing it for the rest of the year, but if not, I'll try and open back up to full capacity in the summer. Let me know what you think, and I hope to be writing some of you all thank you notes as I fulfill orders in a couple of weeks. Thank you to my amazing patrons for keeping everything running as smoothly as possible during this crazy time, and thank you to everyone who patiently waited on this video, and to those of you especially who made it here to the end. I am so grateful for all of your support. Thank you so much. Happy painting, and I will see you next time.